You're sitting comfortably. Would you like to start by identifying yourself? Will they take your name and where and when you were born?
Yes, my name is Michael Lever.
Stay. Lots and lots of
My name is Michael Lever. I'm aged 55. I now live at 4 Buttsmead, Northwood, in Middlesex. I was born in North London, Clapton, on the 13th of February, 1933, and my family my parents moved from North London to Edgware when I was some 18 months old in 1935, and I lived in Edgware until such time as I was married.
Right, we'll come back to that. Your father, his name was?
My father, who is still alive, is called Sidney Lever.
Right, was the name, I imagine, how far back does the name of the form Lever go back?
The family name of Lever, which is spelled L-E-A-V-E-R, goes back to, I think, 1908, 1910. It was, of course, originally Levy, but my father, or his father, I think it was, like so many of his generation, wanted to anglicize it, and so it's been Lever for the last 78 years.
Yes. Tell me a little about your father. What did he do? And,
my father had to leave school at a very early age. I think he boasted he left school, or I'm very sorry that he left school at the age of 11, in order to help his father, who alternated between being a very wealthy man and a very poor man, because unfortunately he gambled quite a lot, and he had to help his father in what was then a hardware shop in Seven Sisters Road, North London. And my father's job in the early days was to do things like weighing up the salt, the butter, and preparing many, many foods, which today we take for granted because they come pre-packaged, but in those days had to be physically got ready for setting over the counter.
really?
That was his early life, and then in the I suppose the late 20s, early 30s, as the electrical retailing industry got underway, he became involved in that, I think first of all through things like recharging bicycle batteries which were used for this newfangled radio, and that was how he entered the radio industry, and he had been in it, was then in it virtually all his working life, which incidentally, of course, is the reason why I too started off in the electrical industry.
So he built up a successful business?
Oh, my father was employed, my father had his own business, his own wholesaling business in the 1930s, but during the Depression in 1936 or 1937, he, like many others, went out of business, and he joined a brother-in-law of his who had a successful electrical distributing business, and he remained with his brother-in-law and that side of the family until shortly after the Second World War, and in 1946 or 1947 he then started his own business, which I subsequently joined in the early 1960s, and in due course took over as my father took a less active part in that business.
Can you tell me something about your father's Jewishness, religious affiliation? Was he much involved Jewishly?
My father's mother, I believe, was fairly orthodox and observant. My father's father, I'm quite certain, was not, although I understand at one time he was very religious and very active in the particularly Orthodox synagogue of which they were members. But then I understand, so often happens, he had a row with the hierarchy of the synagogue, and thereafter became most irreligious. My father's background, I know, was one of not being very closely associated actively with Orthodox Judaism, although he'd always been very active in Jewish organisations. He and my late mother were both very active in helping raise money for hospitals and children's homes and other charities. He and my mother, I think until 1939, actually had a kosher home lived in. It was only during the war when there was difficulty getting kosher meat that they stopped having a kosher home. My father was a founder member of the Edgware United Synagogue. Probably to this day there was a plaque in the synagogue commemorating the first board of management of which he was the chairman. And he was very active there until 1950 probably, when he became rather more interested in the local Reform synagogue. Both my parents have always been associated either with the synagogue or with Jewish communal activities of one sort or another.
So your mother, can you tell me something else about
Yes, my mother's a little unusual. She's now dead. She died about 4 years ago. She actually was born in Stroud in Gloucestershire. And the history why she was there is that her father was originally a tailor in the East End of London. And I suppose there was a time when work was short, difficult to get hold of in the East End of London. And Stroud had, I think, two very well-known, non-Jewish, Christian-owned clothing factories. And my grandfather, great-grandfather, or great-granduncle, first of all went down to Stroud, to become a foreman, looking after the manufacturing of clothing. And of course, very shortly afterwards, he brought other members of his family with him, until in Stroud in Gloucestershire, for some extraordinary reason, for this very extraordinary reason, there was a very large Jewish community, quite separate from the one in nearby Gloucester, and that's where my mother was born. They even had a rabbi there. They even had a visiting, what do you call somebody who richly, shochet, who richly used to go there to kill the chickens for the weekend. And even today there are people in Stroud who remember the Jewish community, which for probably something like half a century played a very active part in the life of that little town. It was a little town, then it's now a big town. And my mother was born there.
What was her name?
Her name was Levy, which isn't very surprising.
Her
maiden name was Levy, and ironically she and my father were actually related. They were third cousins, which probably accounts for one or two funny strains that will come through to me.
Really?
They were third cousins.
What was her first name?
She was always called Kyla, C-I-L-A, but in fact her name was Clara, C-L-A-R-A. Yes.
See. So how did your parents meet? Well, they knew each other as...
They met because when my father was fairly young, his family went down to Stroud in Gloucestershire, although they didn't stay there all that period of time, and that was where he first met my mother. And I think later on she came up to London, and they were friends for many, many years. Genuine friends, because they used to confide in each other about their respective work girlfriends. And it was only, they were comparatively late in life. They were both in their late 20s when eventually they did get married, which was quite old for that particular generation. Not too old, but it was a little on the old side.
When were they married, do you recall?
1931, I think they were married.
And do you have brothers or sisters?
Yes, I have a younger brother, Brian, who's 3 years younger than myself, lives not far away in Pinner.
So there's the two of you.
Just the two of us, yeah.
And what sort of childhood did you have? Was it, well, happy or?
To the best of my knowledge, we had a very nice house in Cannons Park, Edgware, and to the best of my knowledge, it was a very happy childhood. Even the war years, I can only remember the exciting bits, like going out and trying to find the shrapnel the following morning, and the sort of radar, strips of silver paper which was dropped, I think, by either our aircraft or German aircraft to try and confuse each other's radar. We had the odd air raid when we had to spend a long period of time in the shelter. I suppose there was a degree of fear, but otherwise I'm not even aware of the fact that there was a great deal of food rationing. All I can recall is often having to help my mother out by queuing in shops. But I had a very pleasant upbringing. I enjoyed my schooling. I enjoyed the circle of friends.
Where was your schooling?
Initially, I went to a school in Stanmore, Middlesex, Stanburn Primary School, I think it was then called. I left there when I was 11, taking a very old-fashioned exam now, which was called the Scholarship, which enabled me to go to another nearby school, Kingsbury County School, which subsequently was named Kingsbury Grammar School, but of course with the shake-up in our education system, the idea of a grammar school became very unsocially acceptable, and that disappeared. Now, I'd only been at Kingsbury Grammar School for about 3 years when I went to the City of London School right on Victoria Embankment. And I spent the next 3 or 4 years until I left school at the age of 17 and a half there, and thoroughly enjoyed it.
Were you aware of many other Jewish boys being in any of those schools?
From memory, I doubt if there was another Jewish boy at Stanburn. If there was, I can't recall it. There were 1 or 2 only at Kingsbury. At the City of London School, there was, for those days, a relatively high Jewish population, and sufficient that we used to have our own prayers every morning, and certainly travelling down on the tube train from Edgware, there was a very large proportion of Jewish boys. In fact, I think it was one of the problems that the governors of the school had, that although they tried to be fair about it, because in those days the academic success of the young Jewish population seemed to be fairly high, the school was in danger, I think, of being swamped by Jewish youngsters.
Really? How did you were aware of that? How did you feel about that? Any thoughts?
Well, I think I tended to take the line that my parents and their generation took, that there should be no such thing as a Jewish quota in private schools, or in any schools for that matter. But now that I'm a lot older, and I've seen this problem with other institutions, I can see that there is a genuine problem, and it must be very difficult for those people responsible, say, for running a school. But the school was founded by Christian people with money, specifically as an endowment to continue teaching the scriptures and for teaching the Christian way of life. And it must present a genuine problem when they suddenly find that a significant proportion of the school is non-Christian. Today that would be not necessarily Jewish, but that could be Muslim, Hindu as well.
Yes.
And there is a genuine practical problem there.
Michael, so anti-Semitism or persecution in your childhood, or possibly later in life, have you met it at all?
I have met anti-Semitism, very little of it. I can say of a serious nature. Sometimes at school, I can remember little gangs would set up, and they may set on me or they may set on another Jewish lad, but I don't think it's so much that they were anti-Semitic. It was more because, for one reason or another, we might have been slightly different. I dare say if we, in fact, I can't recall them doing the same thing with the Welsh boy, because he was Welsh, and probably the same thing would have happened if I'd been if there'd been a coloured boy there, or a boy that looked peculiar. I think that youngsters tend to gang up on anybody who is slightly different. And I came across very little anti-Semitism. I came across 1 or 2 cases of anti-Semitism when in later years I was in the Air Force. But generally I found that it stemmed from ignorance, or it stemmed from the fact that somebody had had a bad experience with a Jewish person, and they tended to blame it on the Jews in general. But after a while, when they've been in contact with Jewish people and worked with them, played with them, slept with them as we had to do in barracks and gone out on manoeuvres and goodness knows what else, I think that anti-Semitic feeling sort of drifted away in the same way that if you work and play with somebody who is coloured, after a while the fact that they are coloured has very little significance.
Right. Now your religious upbringing, you said you were members of the Edgware?
Yes, we were members of the Edgware United Synagogue, and the Reverend Saul Amius, who is still alive, and he was the first minister appointed there. He was and still is a personal friend of my father's, and he was responsible, well, I shouldn't say that, because he went away during the war, he was a chaplain, but he was quite a close friend of the family, involved with our, to some extent, our religious upbringing, and like many of my generation, we were a somewhat ignorant regular attender of synagogue at the Edgware United Synagogue, and probably I would still be a member of that synagogue today.
Well, were you were bar mitzvah there?
I was bar mitzvah there. I created history, as a number of people in our own synagogue choir know. I had the most atrocious voice. I'm told I have the most atrocious voice. I think it's very nice, but everybody else tells me it's atrocious. I cannot sing in tune. I cannot sing a scale properly. As a result of which, I was the first young man at Edgware United Synagogue that was finally told there is no way that we can get you to sing your Pasha. You are going to have to read it. And that really did create history, because the late Reverend Jerry Fagan had never ever found anybody that he couldn't teach somehow or other to sing. I defeated him.
He was the Hazan?
He was the Hazan, yes.
So you were members?
We were members there, and when I was in my middle teens, a great friend of mine took me one Friday evening to a service at the Edgware Reform, which in those days was held in the Constitutional Club, and I rather liked it, and I used to go along with him fairly regularly, until such time as I went into the Air Force. It was when I came out of the Air Force that, for one reason or another, I and my family became very closely associated with the Reform Synagogue in Edgware, which subsequently moved to purpose-built premises at Sidbury Lodge in Stone Grove. And I was a member there until I came into contact with the Reverend Bernard Hooker from Wembley Liberal Synagogue, and joined the Wembley Liberal Synagogue a year or two before our own synagogue started.
Right. How about youth activities? Have you had played some part in Jewish youth movements?
Youth activities, I helped, well, it goes back a long time. First of all, I was a Boy Scout, around about the age of 13 or 14.
Jewish company?
Yes, it was the 11th Edgware Boy Scouts, which as far as I know is still going. It was attached to the Edgware Synagogue, and I rose to the dizzy heights of patrol leader, and subsequently became a senior scout, and through the Scouts made many of my friends that I still have, and was able to go to did a lot of camping. I went to many overseas places, which otherwise I probably would not have done as a youngster, or may not have done. Oh, and subsequently in later years I also helped with the Cubs. I became an assistant Cub master until I discovered that short trousers wasn't a very good way of getting to know girls. That rather put me off any further scouting activities.
And then Jewish,
When I was first, even before I was married, with my first wife, who was very actively involved with the Brady Boys and Girls Club in the East End of London. So I helped out a bit there, and I was known as a manager, and used to go down there once a week to help supervise the activities.
How did you get on with people who were opposite, on the whole, were they from a chorus?
Well, I suppose to some extent a poorer background, but even by this time, we're now talking in the late 1950s, early 1960s. By this time, of course, there wasn't so much abject poverty in the East End of London. I think a lot of youngsters needed youth clubs because to some extent they were being neglected at home, and they needed to have an opportunity to develop their personalities and enjoy their sporting activities. So youth clubs certainly in those days fulfilled a purpose. I don't think that they were there purely from the point of view of just being soup kitchens. I think that aspect of it was fast fading away. It's no longer necessary.
You found that a satisfying thing to do? Then
Oh
for a
yes,
while?
I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I think round about the same time I was also involved with what's called Junior Norwood. Many years ago, the Norwood Orphanage was an actual orphanage building in Norwood in South London, and all over London there were these associations, Norwood Orphan Aid Societies. There was one in Edgware, and most of these societies tried to get the youngsters of the area involved as well. So it was generally the sons and daughters of the people who were working on the senior committee. And I was for many years involved with the Edgware Young Norwood Orphan Aid Society, and not only did we have our own little social activities and raise funds, but we also used to go down to Norwood and take the youngsters out and help with sports days and other activities. So I was fairly active in that respect. That was actually before I was married.
Was Norwood was this one of the charities which in fact your parents also had?
Yes, my parents were also involved in that. Now I think it's part of the Jewish Board of Guardians, so it probably doesn't have quite the separate identity that it did have some 25, 30 years ago.
Yes.
And then when I was first married, my wife and I carried on with our youth activities, and we became youth leaders at a youth club which was established at what was then Harrow United Synagogue. I think it was actually called Harrow District Synagogue, which doesn't exist anymore. I believe the synagogue subsequently disintegrated, and I think it became taken over by Kenton. And although it was an Orthodox synagogue, my wife and I ran the youth club there, and also around about the same time we came in contact with a new organisation, JYVS, JYVS, which was started by the AJY, and we also had a local JYVS group, which we started, which was very active indeed, and where curiously enough, when we handed over the reins to a certain Tony Sacker and his wife. They took over, and also a coincidence in connection with our congregation, when my first wife and myself were no longer active in the Harrow Youth Club, we were asked to take over from Alan and Joan Lewis, who had for many, many years run the youth club attached to the Wembley Liberal Synagogue. So, funnily enough, two very well-known characters within our own synagogue. We had also known in other roles.
Right, a little bit interesting that although you were progressed, you were reformed, then you were still, as you said, welcomed as managers still in Orthodox stuff.
Well,
that reflects the shortage of people with the expertise in the field.
Well, I suppose the blunt answer is yes, we were the only monks who were prepared to do it. But we did actually have a few clashes with the management of that particular Orthodox synagogue, and it was quite extraordinary around about that time purely for holiday purposes. My wife and I had been to Romania and also made a brief visit to Russia, and there was one member of the board of management of that synagogue who, when they heard about it, immediately thought that we were a couple of flaming Reds, and said that under no circumstances would they allow their sons and daughters to be influenced by communists. And it was very difficult to explain to them that we were in no way politically inclined that way. In fact, even then, I supported the Conservative Party, but it took a little bit of explaining before they accepted that.
Right. so you've had a long interest in that aspect. So going back to your your other side of your career, you left school, and what happened then? Did you go straight into the RAF, was it?
Not quite. I left school at the age of 17 and a half, very foolishly deciding that I didn't need to or didn't want to go on to university, a decision which I now regret. I had at that time had an offer from an uncle of mine who was running a radio television manufacturing company to enter the business with a view to eventually helping he and his son, him and his son in the business. And initially I was sent to Dublin to learn rather more about a small business with which they were associated there. I was in Dublin, Ireland for about 6 months, came back and started working in the factory at Park Royal in West London. I was there for about another 6 months before I was then called up into the Air Force, where for 2 years I did my national service, during which time I'm glad to say I had the opportunity of going to Germany. I was stationed there for quite a while.
What impression did that make on you then?
Ironically, it turned me from being very biased against the Germans, from being anti-German, to really not exactly becoming a pacifist, because I don't believe being a pacifist is a way to stop wars, but it taught me a train journey that I took when I was sent from England to be posted in Germany. The train journey in the early 1950s went across northern Europe, across Holland and a bit of Belgium, and then into Germany, and I can still see the devastation that had caused by the Second World War, by our bombers, by German bombers, by shells, one thing or the other. And by the time I'd finished that rather long journey, I think it was about 18 hours, I had lost a lot of my anti-German feeling, because I realized that wars are terrible and they do affect everybody. And that was a rather salutary lesson to me.
Right. So, in your rest, did you do anything of any interest? What were you on the ground? Were you
I was eventually commissioned in the Air Force, and in fact I was one of 3 young pilot officers who, as an experiment, were sent out to Germany for the first time. They had national service officers, and we went to very small radar units, which were virtually units that were built around vehicles with machinery on them that had stopped as the Allies had advanced to the end of the Second World War and the ceasefire came along. So these radar operating vehicles stopped in various places, and they didn't go any further, and eventually little camps grew up around them, and these were subsequently, of course, became permanent bases, but even when I was out there, they were really field units, and we were actually stationed in an airline army mess in Munster, and we used to have to go out every morning from 20-30 miles to the field units in order to operate the radar equipment. And in my particular case, I was involved in what was called fighter control. That was instructing our aircraft when they were doing their patrols and their exercises in the air.
How about Jewish life? Was there enough Jews together to have any services?
I came across very few Jewish people, except once a year, of course. I think it probably only occurred once. We had leave, and we were encouraged to go to go to Hamburg, where a number of Jewish servicemen met in an old people's home that had been made available to us. This was for Yom Kippur, and we had some sort of service. Oh yes, I can remember, at the very last moment, the visiting rabbi or chaplain didn't turn up, because by chance I was the most senior officer, that is, a very junior pilot officer, but I was the most senior officer. So I can remember at about 5 minutes' notice, I had to take the service and concoct some sort of sermon or reading. No, it was fairly informal. I suppose there were 30 or 40 Jewish at all in the Air Force, but this was because we were in Germany.
And did you have any contact with the remaining Jewish population, such as it was in Germany? Or
I
elsewhere?
cannot recall coming across a single civilian Jewish person. No, I didn't.
Right. So that was 2 years in the RAF.
2 years in the RAF.
And you then came out and
I then came out, I went back to the company I'd been working with previously, and I went through the various sides of the business, the production side, the sales side, the advertising, marketing side, well, all through the business. I learned a great deal. Unfortunately or fortunately, my uncle decided in the 1960s that the competition was getting very hot in the manufacture of radio and television sets, and he received an offer which he felt he couldn't refuse, and so he sold out. And the new management decided that they didn't really want to have anybody around who had previously been associated with the family that owned the business, and so I was given a golden handshake. In those days it wasn't a golden handshake. I think it was a very sort of smutty handshake. I think I got £250, and about 4 weeks' notice. That was that. I had to start on my own. Although subsequently I did join my father, and we built up a business between us.
can I ask you, now when did you get married? How old were you then?
I was first married at the age of 27 or 28. I was first married in 1960.
And your first wife's name was?
My first wife was called Penelope Diamond Corbett, and we had 2 daughters, and after about 6 months of living in Camden Town, moved to a house in Paynes Lane, Pinner.
Yes. You had met her previously through through which movement? Or?
No, I'd met her socially. I actually met her at a dinner party, although I suppose our paths would have crossed sooner or later, but no, in fact I met her at a dinner party.
So you both in fact were helped in the same youth work?
No, we didn't actually. No, I don't think we actually helped in the same youth work before we were married, although afterwards, of course. No, sorry, when we were engaged, we were helping. That's right, down at Brady, and subsequently we both, of course, did things together.
Right. So when you got to Paynes Lane, which synagogue were you members of?
Well, I think that when I was at Paynes Lane, I was actually a member of Edgware Reform Synagogue, because I can remember on one occasion out of bravado actually walking from Sidbury Lodge, Stone Grove, to back home to Paynes Lane Pinner. It was a very fine night. And one of the people that I got to know quite well at Sidbury Lodge was Alan Lyon, who years later joined our own synagogue.
Right. So, but you said you met Bernard Hooker, and that led you to join?
Yes, through my first mother-in-law, who remarried a gentleman who came from Birmingham. I met Bernard and Eileen Hooker, and accepted Bernard's invitation to come along to Wembley Liberal Synagogue. He was given a most warm welcome by the gentleman who was on the door that particular Shabbat morning, a certain Mr. Geoffrey Davis, who is now a member of our synagogue. And my wife and I liked the atmosphere, we liked the synagogue so much that we stayed, or became and stayed members for several years, until, of course, our own synagogue, Pinner Northwood Liberal Synagogue, or Pinner District Liberal congregation was formed.
Right. You didn't find any great difficulty in moving from Reform liturgy to Liberal?
None whatsoever.
Services?
None at all.
In fact, you moved from Orthodox to Reform.
Yes.
So you had you moved to one of my questions we're looking at is why people move to this particular area. You moved to Camden Town to Pinner, was it?
No. My first wife had originally lived in Golders Green. I lived in Edgware. We had difficulty, as all young married couples do, in finding suitable accommodation. As my place of work, my office was then at Swiss Cottage, we finally found the top floor, which had originally been the servants' quarters, of one of those rather nice houses in Regent's Park Road, which overlooks the zoo and Regent's Park. And as I say, we stayed there for about 6 months before we found a house which happened to be in Pinner. Except for the fact that it was a very nice area, there's no real reason why we moved to Pinner, except possibly years and years ago when I was a very keen cyclist. I used to like coming out to Pinner Village. So maybe because I knew Pinner from my very, very early youth, maybe that's one reason that we eventually settled here.
So then you became involved in Northwood and Pinner, as you said. Were you in at the beginning?
Yes, before you came, Brian, I actually got hold of a very old diary, which I'll just
Yes.
bring in and show
Oh,
you.
yes. Right. Right, you've got a diary there of what year is
Well,
this?
I'm one of these people who always keeps my old diaries, and I thumbed back into 1964 diary, and I have an entry here for Tuesday, the 10th of March, 1964, which says sort of Pinner and District Lib, 8:15, Acre Hall, Rickmansworth Road, Northwood. And that was I think that must have been the second meeting that was held. I believe there had been an earlier meeting, but as those days, earlier meeting in February, in those days I used to travel such a lot into the provinces, I probably wasn't around for that meeting, so I actually came to the second meeting, and I can remember that by a fairly narrow majority, it was decided to go ahead with the formation of the synagogue or congregation. As I had very foolishly put my name down as being prepared to help, I subsequently discovered that I was on the first steering committee or ad hoc council, and curiously enough,
Yes.
I was actually away travelling when the first sort of unofficial committee meeting was held, and various duties were allocated to the people who were there, and for no reason whatsoever, except probably by default, when I came back, I was told by the sort of self-elected chairman, Anna Lewis, that I had been made editor of whatever new magazine it was that we had, and publicity officer. And so I found myself editor of something which initially was called the Newsletter, subsequently became known as Devar, and if you like, my little claim to fame within our congregation is that I was the first editor of our regular newsletter, which was literally, the first one was literally one side of a sheet of A4, and I actually typed it myself in the office, and even ran it off on the office duplicator. But don't worry, I mean, there were only 30 or 40 copies that were required.
Had you had previous experience of anything of this type?
Not really, except I can remember on one of our opportune courses, officer cadet training courses when I was in the Air Force, I helped produce a course magazine. I suppose I always prided myself on being able to write English, and I suppose it was enthusiasm more than ability which enabled me to do the job.
Yes. Did you expand it via rather more than the one sheet, I believe?
Oh,
before you
yes.
finished?
Before very long it had become an 8 or 10 page booklet, so much so that I could no longer type it out, as I was only a one-finger typist. And I remember such stalwarts as Bill Hazel, Joan Lewis, sorry, not Joan Lewis, another Mrs. Lewis, who really helped, and every month they used to type it out before it went off to be duplicated.
Yes. Something I should I might have asked about your school days. You said you regretted you didn't go to university. What were you good at school? You passed all the you passed A levels or equivalents in.
Thank you for
Service
flattering me, Brian. They were not A levels. In those days it was
Yeah.
called
Certificate.
school certificate.
Yes.
And yes, I think I got credit in 7 or 8 subjects, failing most dismally in Latin.
Oh.
But I didn't go on to the, I think it was it an A level that you could get? The school certificate, and then there was another one.
Scholarship.
There was another more senior diploma, a school evening diploma. I certainly didn't go on for that. I just got my school certificate.
Great. So,
And I wasn't particularly good at anything, except I always enjoyed history, and I was relatively good at geography. Bad at sports, mediocre at languages, and all right with maths, only up to a point, but when it became complicated, I couldn't really follow.
right. So going back to the congregation, you edited the newsletter for how many years? Or?
I think for 2 or 3 years before late Bertram Jacobs took over. You'd have to check the records
Yes.
on that one. And then
Then what did
only
you do?
about 4 or 5 years ago, when the then editor, Alan Lester, had to give it up at very short notice, I took it over again for a period of 6 or 9 months. So I thoroughly enjoyed it.
But when you gave up being editor, you continued on. Were you?
Oh
Synagogue
yes, by
Council
that,
in the early
but
days?
I was of course on Synagogue Council, and I think I became the assistant treasurer to Harry Hazel, subsequently became treasurer, and then served a stint of 2 or 3 years as chairman.
How did you find the congregation had grown obviously considerably by that stage? How did you find being chairman?
I think I can say that I thoroughly enjoyed every minute of it. In those days it was still a relatively small congregation, growing at a quite fast pace. Most of the people were quote, the old-timers, and during my time as chairman, it was the big thing was the possibility of finding new premises. We had by that time moved into Westbury Lodge, and we were looking for new premises, and then we found the premises, of course, in the Methodist Church,
In Hallowell Road,
in
yes.
Hallowell Road.
That was in your time as chairman.
Yes, that was in my time as chairman.
So it was under your chairmanship you arranged to move into Hallowell Road, and